In your required reading for this last topic in the course, there is an article from Scientific American from a philosopher known as Dave Chalmers, in which he introduced a term that has become famous in the treatment of this many-faceted concept of consciousness. He introduced the notion of the hard question of consciousness. And this relies also on a piece of philosophical jargon known as Qualia, which we will get to. Now, in posing a hard question of consciousness, that sort of presupposes that there are easy questions of consciousness. And we need to be careful. We need to know what sense the words hard and easy are being used here. Easy does not mean that the solution, the answer, the explanation, the account, the description is right there for the taking, or that we know how to do it, or that it's easy in any sense. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that the easy problems of consciousness are the kinds of questions that can be addressed using the kind of scientific methods that we have, using the kind of concepts that we have. Which leaves the hard problem of consciousness as being the kind of problem that in principle cannot be addressed using the kind of scientific methods, techniques and traditions that we have. So once more, easy does not mean simple or ready to hand. Easy here means potentially addressable using scientific methods. So, for example, one of the easy questions has to do with access consciousness. Why do we have access consciousness to some information and not others? Now, we've just seen in the last video some experimental work using fMRI and EEG that was based on a model that itself was built on a metaphor. All of this may seem a little bit wobbly to you, and it should. It's not very secure knowledge, but that's how science works. We characterize phenomena as best we can, and then we build models, and then we design experiments to test those models. That's sort of what we do. So in that respect, the questions being asked by Stan DeHaan and others in that work we reviewed pertain to the easy question. So someday we might have better, richer stories with some predictive content related to the kind of scenario studied by those experiments. Here's another easy question of consciousness, and this one brings to the fore a different sense of consciousness that we haven't met yet. Consciousness can also be used to describe an overall state, and we use the term then to distinguish between such qualitatively different states as being awake and being asleep. Those are perfectly unproblematic concepts. Doesn't necessarily mean we have full scientific accounts of them, but we all know what we mean by being awake and being asleep. Furthermore, we are aware of other states of consciousness. One could take psychedelic drugs. There are forms of madness. Hypnosis is a very interesting altered state of consciousness. Coma represents a very, very important state of consciousness. Now, when I say state of consciousness, I'm using that word consciousness in a completely different sense to access consciousness, or what we're building up to, study of phenomenal consciousness. Here, states of consciousness is this everyday sense that we can distinguish between these senses. So, this is a separate but extremely useful sense of the term consciousness, which has enormous clinical relevance because we would like to develop means for distinguishing among these, and for example, for asking about differences in types of coma, differences in brain activity for people who are not awake and behaving. We want to know, are there more than one state there? Should we make distinctions? These are, in some sense, life and death distinctions, because a doctor may decide that someone has or has not the potential for quality of life based on how these states of consciousness are characterized. Now, that everyday sense of states of consciousness works in an everyday sense, and it is much more difficult when it comes to looking at brains, because the relationship brains, consciousness. This is very difficult territory. But what we can ask is these signals we can record from the brain, these very hard to read signals, they might look differently depending on which state of consciousness someone is in. And we could ask then another easy question about the neural correlates of consciousness. So we might ask, well, what does an EEG pattern look like in a coma? What does an EEG pattern look like when you're awake? Those are perfectly well-formed scientific questions that we can pursue. Other senses of the term consciousness can also be used in this way. So the term neural correlates of consciousness is more frequently used for this kind of picture, in which consciousness is assumed to be some kind of product of the brain based on sensory input. This is the representationalist picture that we've seen before. So in the picture here, you see someone looking at something called the outside world. I've never found, but there you go. And there is some brain activity that relates to that person's perception of the dog in the outside world. And one could ask, what is that brain activity? How does it relate to, for example, seeing the dog? So in some sense, much of the neuroscience we've looked at follows more or less alternative versions of easy questions of consciousness. They're looking, so if you start to couch your account of what's going on in terms of visual information and cortical activity, you can follow cortical activity. You can measure from the brain, and this is how the what stream and the where stream, the dorsal stream and the ventral stream were uncovered, for example. We can ask more questions about perception. We can ask, for example, how is it that we only see, we only have one visual experience, but we have these two visual pathways? How is that possible? How should we understand that? How come we don't have two visual experiences? This is a problem known as the binding problem, and although we don't have an answer to that, I'm not sure it's a well-formed question. It's the kind of question that we can investigate using standard scientific methods. So easy questions abound. They are simply questions that we can pose in a scientific idiom. The hard question is the question of phenomenal consciousness, which we have held off from addressing right now. Why does anything feel like anything at all? How do we incorporate this problematic notion of subjective experience into a scientific picture? Now, subjective experience is in some sense the most important thing, the only thing in your world. Take that away and you're dead. Yet making a noun of it is inordinately difficult, and we don't have a way of characterizing subjective experience as an object, as a thing. And you can see my words already becoming unstable. Our language around this question is unreliable. And in the required reading from Dave Chalmers, he'll expand upon this. And one of the terms he uses, one that I've always found very problematic, is the notion of qualia. So as well as so we see colors, for example. We see that I can see some red things and some green things where I'm sitting. But those words don't tell you what it feels like to see red. There is a feel to seeing red that's different from the feel of seeing green. These are not just labels. They also, I suppose, they mean something in an experiential sense. And this sense in which they mean something is inherently subjective. It has been suggested, I think wrongly, that there's no way to tell whether your subjective experience of red matches mine. Perhaps your subjective experience of red is the same as my subjective experience of blue, and as long as we still draw the same contrasts in the world, our language might not allow us to see that. I don't think that's quite true, but I'm not going to get involved in that. The word qualia is reserved then for those aspects of experience which are ineffable in a sense. They cannot be expressed directly in language. They are constitutive of experience, so they're intrinsic to experience. They're private. Your qualia and my qualia are not the same thing. And some people speak of direct presentation to consciousness. Now, that term may or may not be helpful. A lot of people don't like that term. Some people do like that term. The point is that when we come to the question of how do we experience anything at all, what is it to experience, to have feelings, for something to be qualitative? Our language is challenged. So another interesting thought experiment we have from Dave Chalmers is the philosophical notion of a zombie. Those are not real, not that kind of zombie. But a philosophical zombie is a person who walks and talks like a person, but is entirely lacking any qualia. That is, someone who, for whom there is no sense in which they are having an experience. They merely behaviourally simulate a person. This is the philosophically deep notion that was presented in the film Blade Runner with the notion of a replicant. Replicants are behaviourally, when you observe a replicant, you can't tell the difference between one and a person, or it's very difficult to. They have ways in the film. So the question is that even coherent? Is this a coherent thought? Could that be, does it mean anything to suggest that one could have something that looks like a person, but there's no light on inside? So this subjective world of raw feeling is something that philosophers have great difficulty in dealing with. Everyday people have great difficulty in dealing with. Our language is not stable here. Here's another thought experiment, because this area is full of thought experiments. They're not real experiments, they're just thinking exercises. Here's one. Supposing there was a woman called Mary, and Mary's a neuroscientist, and she has weird parents who raised her in a black and white world. But they allowed her, they homeschooled her, and they taught her all kinds of things, and they gave her access to all the black and white versions of every book ever published, black and white computers to access a black and white world. And Mary decided perversely to become a neuroscientist who studies colour, the neuroscience of colour perception. So Mary has now read all the books on colour perception, but she's lived in an entirely black and white world. What do you know about colour that Mary does not? What is there about colour to know that you could not, in principle, get from books? That's the sort of sense that the word qualia is trying to explore. Phenomenal consciousness, not an easy scientific subject.